Let's give this a little whisk. Hi bakers, I'm Sally, and today I'm showing you how to make homemade pie crust. Now, homemade pie crust does not have to be intimidating. It's really just a few simple ingredients put together to make a delicious foundation for your homemade pies. Now, pie crust is not meant to be sweet, so there's actually no sugar in the pie dough at all because typically the filling is the sweet part of your pie. The only dry ingredients we need are flour and salt. When we're measuring our flour, we always want to make sure we're spooning and leveling it. Otherwise, if we scoop our flour, it could pack down the flour. If you have a kitchen scale, go ahead and use that instead. This is just regular all-purpose flour we're using in the pie dough. I'm using my big mixing bowl because I like to make pie dough by hand. You can also use a food processor for this recipe if you have one. We're just using regular salt in this recipe, nothing super fancy or special. Give the dry ingredients a whisk. Now, my #1 tip for a successful pie crust is to make sure the ingredients you're using are very cold. Obviously, flour and salt are not typically cold ingredients, so what I like to do is I like to pop all of the dry ingredients in the refrigerator or freezer while I measure out the butter and shortening. Now, a lot of pie dough recipes call for all butter, and I actually have an all butter pie crust recipe on my website. For this recipe, it's my favorite. I like to use both butter and shortening. Now, butter will obviously give us that delicious buttery flavor, but shortening is going to keep our pie dough's structure because shortening has a higher melting point, so when the pie dough hits the oven, it's really gonna keep its shape. Now again, the ingredients need to be very cold so the pie dough melts in the oven and not in your hands as you're mixing it up. If your pie dough is too warm, like your shortening and butter is too warm, the pie dough is going to become too wet as you're rolling it out and it's just gonna keep tearing. And I know we've all kind of experienced that problem before. So again, very cold ingredients, it's pie dough success. Now the shortening is also very helpful, especially if you're making pretty pie crust designs on top of your pie, like a lattice, maybe you're braiding pie dough using cookie cutters, all of those beautiful pies you see. Again, I really like to use shortening because it just gives that added structure and stability to the pie dough. If you're using the sticks of shortening, you're going to cut it and cube it exactly how we cubed our butter. In the next step, we're going to work the shortening and butter into the dry ingredients. Now you can use a food processor for that step, but I prefer to use a pastry cutter because you really get a feel for the dough. Also, a food processor can quickly overwork everything and your pie crust can end up tasting dense and crumbly. Dry ingredients are nice and cold, and this is actually gonna make this whole next process even easier because the colder the ingredients, the easier it is to work with. We're gonna work both of the fats into the dough at the same time. Get our shortening here. And I just use a spoon, it just helps get it out. Super easy. Now with a pastry cutter, it's just a little simple turn of the wrist. If you don't have a pastry cutter and you don't have a food processor, you can do this with 2 forks. One of the #1 mistakes when making homemade pie crust is overworking the fat into the flour. You're really just looking for little pea-sized bits of fat. You actually want those bigger pieces of fat because those are going to melt in the oven and create all of those delicious flaky layers. As you can see, the mixture is very crumbly. You have some larger pieces, but most of them are pretty small little pea-sized crumbles. Last ingredient, extra cold ice water. We're mixing in just a little bit at a time until the dough begins to clump together. When the weather is very humid outside, you may not need as much ice water, or when it's really dry during those Thanksgiving holiday months, you might need a little extra. You really just need to go for the feel of the dough in this step. Again, I like to mix in just a little bit at a time. That way we don't accidentally add too much. We want the dough to clump together but not feel overly sticky. If you accidentally add too much water and the dough starts to feel overly sticky, you can add a little flour to help absorb that extra water. Feel free to feel the dough with your hands as you go. This still feels a little dry. I can see some dry flour bits down here, so I'm going to add just a little bit more. Another tip is we can replace half of the ice cold water with ice cold vodka. Now, alcohol does not develop as much gluten as water does, which means your pie dough is going to be even flakier, which is great if you accidentally overwork the pie dough when you're making it. At this point, we can pour everything out onto a work surface and begin bringing the dough together by hand. Have a little extra flour nearby, flour your hands, get the work surface floured a little bit. You can see it's a little crumbly, that's okay, it's just not overly sticky, but still able to clump together when you bring it together with your hands. This dough actually feels a little dry to me, it's not coming together quite as nicely, so I'm going to dip my fingers in a little bit of ice water and kind of tap the dough a little bit, work the water in, so it's just clumps together a little easier. Now this dough is enough to make 2 pie crusts, so we can cut it in half. I don't measure it, I kind of just eyeball it at this point. Cut it right in half. And you can see all of these beautiful flakes and layers inside of the dough. That's just gonna translate into your baked pie crust. Now, cold temperature is your pie dough's best friend, so we have to chill these doughs before we roll them out and use them to make a pie. So we have our 2 halves right here, flatten them into about 1-inch thick discs. The disc shape is just gonna make rolling out easier after the pie dough is chilled. Now the pie dough has to chill for at least 2 hours or up to 5 days, so if you are really ahead of the game, you can go ahead and prep all of your pie dough way in advance. I had this dough chilling overnight. Again, this recipe makes 2 crusts, but we only want to work with 1 at a time, so keep the other one in the refrigerator until you're ready to roll it out. Flour your work surface, flour your hands, sprinkle of flour on the dough, and a rolling pin. Begin rolling. Now when rolling, make sure that you're not pressing too hard on the pie dough. You're not mad at it, I always like to say that. You're not mad at the pie dough. To make sure it's not sticking, you can flip it. You can also rotate it every now and then. Add a little more flour. One of the common issues you may experience, and I've experienced it plenty of times too, is the edges of the dough can begin to crack. Very, very easy fix. Moisten your fingertips with just a little bit of ice cold water and begin melding them back together so the edges are nice and clean. We're rolling it out to about a 12-inch circle, which will fit nicely into a 9-inch pie dish. You can see all the bits of butter and the shortening marbled throughout the dough. That just means all the more flaky layers. My #1 trick when transferring the pie dough to your pie dish, just use your rolling pin. Roll it back carefully, pick it up, and roll it backwards onto your rolling pin. Grab your dish and roll it right out. Make sure it's nice and centered. You're gonna have a little bit of overhang. That's good, that just gives you more dough to work with. And because we rolled it out a little larger than the pie dish, we'll have extra dough around the sides to create a beautiful decorative edge. Tuck it in, make sure it's nice and tight, and then fold the edges in. And I'm just using my fingers to do this. This pie dough you can use for any kind of pie. This one will be an apple pie. And you'll notice I didn't grease the pie dish, and that's because there's so much fat inside the dough, you really don't need to. Lots of ways we can make a nice, pretty decorative edge. Let me show you how to flute it. I'm gonna use my knuckle, 2 fingers, and I'm just pinching the 2 together to make a beautiful fluted design. And now we just have a beautiful classic look for our apple pie. To make sure our dough stays cold, because we just worked with it so much, I'm going to put it back in the refrigerator so it can set its shape before baking. With the second half, we're gonna use it as the top crust, but if you're making a pie that doesn't need a top crust, you can freeze this for up to 3 months. Since this is a double crust pie, I'm actually going to flute the edges once I'm finished getting the lattice topping and the bottom pie crust together. I'm just using my fingers to kind of meld them together. And then we can go ahead and flute the edges to make that nice, beautiful decorative edge. You could also crimp it with a fork. A great pie crust is the foundation for every great pie. You can truly taste the homemade difference, and I hope my recipe and all of my success tips take the intimidation out of the process for you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel inspired to try a new baking recipe today. Head over to my website for the full written recipe and all of my success tips. You can also ask questions right there on the recipe page, and my team and I will be happy to answer.